Okay, so hello everyone, good evening, and assalamu alaikum to each and every fellow. So, ladies and gentlemen, and our esteemed guest speaker, welcome to the Climate Finance Leadership Series. The Buraaq Association, are thrilled to have you join us for today's session that has a name from policy to action, translating climate finance strategies into action. Uh, the whole series, Climate Finance Leadership Series, was designed to bring together leaders, experts, and practitioners from various sectors to deepen our understanding of climate finance and explore innovative solutions to one of the most pressing challenges of our time, that is climate change. And as we will navigate the complexities of climate finance, it is imperative that we bridge the gap between policy formulation and effective implementation. And today, we will delve into how we can translate well-intentioned uh, strategies into tangible actions that drive real impact in our communities, economies, and ecosystems. And today, in this evening, we are honored to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Ms. Melissa Pradhan, and she's an international speaker. She's from Nepal. She is an accomplished development professional with extensive experience in climate finance policy research and international development. She currently serves as a consultant at Global Child Nutrition and has previously worked with globally renowned organizations, including IWMI, that is International Water Management Institute, OPM, Oxford Policy Management, and FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. So, and she is a recognized leader in the field of climate finance and policy. She brings a wealth of knowledge and experience from her climate finance background, and she has been instrumental in the climate finance domain. And in today's session, she will share insights on the current landscape of climate finance, the challenges of implementation, and actionable strategies that can help us realize our climate goals. So before we begin, I encourage all of you to take a moment to reflect your experience and your challenges, and we will have a Q&A session later on. So please jot down your any question you may have throughout the presentation. With further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Miss Melissa to the stage. So Miss Melissa, the stage is all to you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Danielle. I don't know if I'll be able to live up to all of that, but I shall definitely give it a shot. Good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for showing up at this time of the day or night. So it makes me really happy to be here to discuss with you what I think is the most challenging issue that we face as a world today. And, my intention with this session is to really ensure that by the end of it, you are able to really understand the basics of climate change science. And then I hope that you will build on that knowledge further so that, you come up with the most innovative climate solutions, and then that you are also able to identify all the opportunities that come up with the challenge of climate change. Okay, so I will be diving very deep into the basics of climate change science and climate finance for today. So I have a lot to get through to cover, so I'll just get to it. Okay, so I'm going to start with addressing any sort of skepticism that one might have about climate change being caused by humans. Okay, so we're first going to start with that. You really need to understand more than anything that the Earth's temperature is a balancing act, right? So what do we mean by that? When there's incoming energy from the sun, then obviously the Earth warms. When that energy is reflected, Earth avoids warming. And when the energy is released back into the atmosphere, then the Earth cools, right? So this balance, or this Earth's energy or Earth's temperature, has previously, historically, over millions of years, been affected by a lot of different natural factors. But it is critical to understand that the changes that we've seen since mid 20th century, it really cannot be accounted to all of these natural causes alone. Okay, so we're just gonna look into three different natural factors, and we're going to look into why we know that the climate change that we're experiencing today is not caused by natural factors. Okay, so number one, we're going to start with the Milankovitch cycles. Okay, very simple. Milankovitch cycles is basically combine Milankovitch cycles basically comprises of three different motions of the earth. One is the shape of the orbit, which is also called the eccentricity. So the shape of the orbit, it changes from being circular to elliptical. And because of that shape, climate has changed in the past, right? So we also have seasons because of the shape of the orbit, the varying shape of the orbit. The second motion is the wobble of the Earth. As it moves in the orbit, it sort of wobbles. And that wobble can also determine how much energy is incoming from the sun and thus our climate, right? And the third motion is the tilt of the Earth. So the Earth tilts between 22.1 to 24.5 degrees. And this tilt can really determine how much energy we're getting from the sun, right? So historically, these motions have definitely caused climate change. But the climate change that we're seeing now is not being caused due to Milankovitch cycles. And how do we know that? Because the change that occurs because of these motions, it happens from, let's say, the change we see it between 10,000 to 100,000 years. So the change is very gradual, it's very slow, right? But the climate change that we're experiencing right now is if you look at the timeline, then the change that we've seen, it's so drastic. It just happened in the last 150 years. So we can be pretty sure that the changes that we're seeing right now is not being caused due to these three motions, which are called the Milankovitch cycles. And even if we say, okay, let's say, okay, it's caused by the Milankovitch cycles, then even if so, based on these three motions, the Earth should actually start cooling right now, but it's actually warming. So we know for sure it's not because of this. Okay. The second natural factor is solar irradiance. So solar irradiance is basically the amount of energy we receive from the sun, right? And even with solar energy, if you look at the graph on the right, then you'll notice in yellow, that's the amount of solar irradiance. Solar irradiance has in fact decreased slightly and not increased. But if you look at the temperature, which is denoted in red in the graph, then you see that temperature has increased, but solar irradiance has in fact decreased, which basically means that it's not being caused due to solar irradiance either, right? And had it been due to energy from the sun or solar irradiance, then all the layers of the atmosphere, I'm pretty sure you know that there are different layers of the atmosphere. So all the layers of the atmosphere should have had heated up. But at the moment, only the lower layer of the atmosphere, which is the troposphere, is being heated up, and the stratosphere is in fact cooling. So we know it's also not being caused due to solar irradiance. And third is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? So when climate has changed in the past, millions of years ago, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has always remained between 180 parts per million to 280 parts per million, right? But as of April 2026, just a few months ago, and as of now, you can see the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has reached a record high of 430.50 parts per million, and that's something that we've never seen before. So because of all of this, majority of the scientists do agree that the current climate change that we're experiencing is being caused due to human activities, and that it is anthropogenic in nature, right? So, and this graph also shows that the amount of carbon dioxide has coincides with the increase in temperature, and that coincides with the timeline of when the Industrial Revolution started. Okay. So what exactly as climate change. And I think this is a concept, the whole concept of global warming is something that we're very familiar with, but I'll just go through it briefly. So when human activities, while we do our activities, we're emitting a lot of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And these greenhouse gases are creating a blanket-like structure in the atmosphere of the Earth, trapping energy and thereby heating the globe. And this is the phenomena of global warming. But global warming is only one aspect of climate change. Okay. Um, the thing that we don't realize is that when the globe, that, okay, I'll just move on to the next slide. So the thing that we don't realize is that the temperature is a parameter that affects majority of the other parameters. Okay. What do I mean by that? When temperature increases, water expands. It's just basic physics. When temperature increases, water expands. So what can we expect when there's global warming happening? There's increased temperature, seawater is expanding, then there's sea level rise. On the other hand, there's increased temperature. What happens? Ice melts, so thereby glaciers are melting, which is also in turn causing sea levels to rise. So what happens when sea level rises? We can expect coastal floodings. We can expect damages to low-lying areas. We can expect freshwater intrusion by salt water because the water tables are all off now, right? So the second thing that happens, another thing that happens when temperature increases is that the atmosphere, the ability of the atmosphere to hold moisture in the air increases, which means at 20 degrees Celsius, air can hold twice the amount of moisture than it can at 10 degrees Celsius. That means, so there's an increased rate of evaporation because the temperatures have risen. And because the temperature has risen, the atmosphere can hold more moisture. And because the atmosphere can hold more moisture, it means we are seeing heavier rainfalls and more frequent rainfalls. And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us in terms of its impact on us? Is that, when rainfall is heavier than it should be, it damages crops. There's soil erosion. There's an increased flood risk, pluvial flooding. And then when there's flooding, we can expect the water quality to decrease. When water quality decreases, we are more susceptible to waterborne diseases, thereby creating public health issues. So yeah, in similar manner, temperature, when it increases the rate of evaporation, which means there are more dry lands. I don't want to get into this too much because I think it's very, very evident that temperature, when it increases, there are a lot of changes that happens to other parameters that maintain our world's ecosystems, right? Another impact of climate change is ocean acidification. So when temperature increases, ocean has the ability, sorry, let me go back on that. Do you remember the first slide where I said the Earth's temperature is a balancing act? So one of the reasons why Earth is able to maintain this temperature is also because of oceans. Okay, so oceans have the ability to absorb a lot of heat. So if there's a lot of heat in the atmosphere, it absorbs the heat for us, thereby decelerating, what we could have seen. The amount of increased temperature we could have seen is actually being balanced by oceans, right? So it also means that oceans have the ability to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But what happens? It's helping in slowing down the whole phenomena of climate change. But as it does those things, there's a lot of changes in the chemistry of seawater happening, right? So without getting into the details of it, there's ocean acidification happening, and that's affecting coral reefs, which is in turn, we know that coral reefs are the base of the marine ecosystem. So the entire marine ecosystem and the food chains are being affected by it. The other thing is that the ocean, like I said, absorbs heat. Then so the temperature, the sea surface temperature at the top, of the oceans also increases because it's absorbing heat from the atmosphere, right? So that changes the ocean currents that we currently know of, because there's a change in water density, right? So because it's warmer, algae, for example, can thrive even better, which means it multiplies even faster. And that means that there's just a lot more bacteria. That means if there are even more bacteria, then seafood, when we ingest it, it has a lot of more illnesses associated with it, right? So that's the thing. Okay, I won't go into the detail of all of this. The basic idea is that we're just talking about global warming, but unfortunately, temperature is a parameter that affects other parameters, and these are all the impacts that we can expect from the phenomena of global warming. Okay, and um, so the thing is, I think it's very clear by now. The point that I'm trying to make is that climate change isn't just about flooding. Climate change isn't just about droughts. For example, if we take flooding as an example, we're also talking about the damage it does to the infrastructure. So when infrastructure gets damaged, we're also talking about the amount of investment, like finance, that we've invested in that particular building. We've lost it, right? Or roads, for example, we've lost it due to flooding. We're also talking about increased public health concerns in terms of, like we discussed earlier, decreased water quality causing waterborne diseases because of flooding. So that is also another cascading effect of climate change, right? Then we can also, if there's flooding happening, we can also expect it to disrupt global supply chains. We can also expect communities to migrate from flood-prone areas. So we're talking about, we're not just talking about flooding, we're just talking about we're dealing with a lot of different cascading impacts of climate change. And the unfortunate thing is that the disadvantaged and marginalized groups suffer the most. Okay, so right now I'm just going to give an example. I wasn't planning to, but I'm just going to give an example of a community in Nepal. Okay, and how climate change affects girls differently. So, say there's a village in Nepal, and this is an actual story, right? So somehow the burden of cooking, the burden of being in the kitchen falls on the woman in the family, right? So that also means that they have to walk towards water sources because they do not have taps and stuff. So they have to walk to water sources to get water for their cooking, for the cleaning of the houses and all of that. So what has actually happened is, because water sources have now dried up due to increased temperatures, um, these women have had to walk even more further, higher up, further down, and that physical strain from having to carry very heavy water jars over a long distance every day has caused a public health concern of their uteruses have collapsed, and they've lost lives. They've had to remove their uterus. They've had a lot of different health issues because of that. So this is just one example of how climate change affects women disproportionately. And there could be so many other examples, but okay, we just move on to the next slide for now. Okay. um Another thing about climate change is that we are really running against time when it comes to it. And why do I say this is because, let's say miraculously we are able to halt all of our greenhouse gas emissions today, right? Not possible, but let's say we did. The unfortunate thing is that climate change would still happen. And that is because these greenhouse gases have a very long lifespan. So all of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've made historically would still cause climate change, right? That is something that we need to know. And, then we're talking about, oh, like the global surface average temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like much. It's probably small. It's probably insignificant. But that's unfortunately not true, right? So you know, we need to realize that when we say the Earth's global surface temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius, we're talking about the average of the entire globe. Uh, in other words, there are regions in the Earth that have already experienced 3 to 4 degrees Celsius increased temperature, including the Himalayas. Um, and then what an additional degree also means is that sorry, and the way this change is happening and the way the temperature is increasing so drastically, so fast, ecosystems and wildlife, they do not have the ability to adapt to these changes because it's happening too fast, right? And so it is critical to understand that every degree increased means even more devastating outcomes and consequences of climate change. And that means we need even more climate finance to adapt to these changes. And so here is just a difference of what a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree increase would look like, right? So I think we've all come across the information that we've already increased our global average temperature since the pre-industrial times by 1.45 degrees Celsius. The last I noted it was that. So what can we expect when temperature increases by 1.5 degrees Celsius than the pre-industrial era? There's a good chance that even though ice sheets are currently melting, that we will be able to reverse the melting. Like we will be able to stop the ice sheets from collapsing completely, right, at 1.5 degrees Celsius. It means that yes, the sea level will rise, but small island states might still, be inundated. But that would probably be by 10 feet, right? And 70% of the coral reefs would probably be destroyed. Yes, that's true, and it is happening. But if it were a 2 degree Celsius increase, which we are headed towards, then there is a pretty good chance that these ice sheets, once they collapse, we won't be able to reverse it. And once they collapse, the sea level rise that we could see is going to increase by 30 feet instead of 10 feet at 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? 99% of the coral reefs would be lost, which means that the entire marine ecosystem is at stake. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen to the livelihoods that depend on it. We could expect crop failures all over the world, multiple areas happening at the same time, which would cause food prices to skyrocket, which could cause many marginalized communities to go hungry. Majority of the world areas would not be, we'd not be able to live in them because it would be too hot. So 1.5 degree increase and a 2 degree Celsius increase, it's just a lot of difference, right? And then we come to the whole idea of tipping points. So tipping points is basically the critical thresholds that if we exceed, then it will lead to large and irreversible changes in the Earth system. And the key word is irreversible. We will not be able to change it back to the way it was, right? And so there are several tipping points that have been identified, nine tipping points that have been identified, but we're just going to look into two because of the limited time that we have. Okay, so why are tipping points important? Let's just take the Arctic sea ice, for example, right? And we go back to the basics of science, physics again, right? So right now we have the sea ice there and it is white in color, so it is able to reflect much of the energy that's coming into the Earth's system, right? So because it is reflecting, like how we saw in the first slide, because it reflects, the energy absorbed is less, so it is preventing the Earth from heating up. But if these ice sheets start melting, then what happens? They turn into a darker. They melt. Then the whole that the whole like water body becomes a very dark color, which in turn will help absorb. You know how during summers we wear white clothes and then, we feel a little bit less hot than we do in black clothes. So the same, it's called the albedo effect. So the same thing happens to the earth, where if these ice sheets start melting, then the whole phenomena of absorbing more energy, it accelerates, and therefore we can expect the entire phenomena of climate change to accelerate. Um, the other thing is like how we mentioned oceans. So far, they're absorbing carbon dioxide. So far, they're absorbing heat. But if we cross the tipping point of these oceans, then they will no longer be able to absorb. In fact, they will start emitting greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then again, causing the whole phenomena to accelerate. And it'll be just very difficult for us to do anything about it. Okay. So I just want to take a moment to, make you just think why mitigating emissions is so difficult. And that is because we live in a very carbon intensive economy. If you think about it, we use a lot of appliances. Those appliances use energy, therefore we're emitting greenhouse gases, right? I'm using light right now. I'm emitting greenhouse gases, right? Uh, okay, then let's say the clothes that I'm wearing, the raw materials when it was made, that emitted greenhouse gases. So once the t-shirt, let's say, was ready, it needed to be shipped from China to Nepal. So that transportation emitted greenhouse gases, right? So the packaging that came in with the clothing, to create that packaging, that emitted greenhouse gases. Then, if we talk about our food as well, to cook our food, we use energy that emits greenhouse gases, right? So, the other thing is, if, for example, we want to grains, right? So we need agricultural lands. How do we get agricultural lands? Because we're cutting forests. What happens when we cut forests? Forests are carbon sinks, which means they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But when we cut forests, then the ability of the earth to balance that temperature, oh sorry, the so what was I saying? So the trees are act as carbon sinks, right? So if the trees are cut, then there are no carbon sinks. And we do cut trees so that we have more agricultural fields. And we need these agricultural fields because we need food. So everything that we do emits carbon. Like our entire economy is made to emit carbon. So and that is why it's very, very difficult to to mitigate emissions. And another thing is that I want you to keep in mind is something about carbon lock-in. So what is carbon lock-in? You know how, let's say, I'm about to build a house, right? The house is going to be there for the next 30 to 40 years at least. So how I build the house is going to lock in the amount of carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions I make for the next 30 to 40 years of me using the building. If I design the building in a way that there are bigger windows, for example, then I would have to use less light as compared to had I made the building with smaller windows, then I'd probably be using light during the daytime as well because I can't see much, right? Or for example, the thickness of the wall, right? If a building's wall thickness is made very thick, um, then even if it's hot outside, it relatively remains colder. Even if it's cold outside, it relatively remains warmer. But as opposed to, a thin wall, if it's hot outside, I'd have to use the AC. If it's cold outside, I'd have to use the AC. So that's the whole role of infrastructure, and that it has on our economy. So that is also a very important concept that we need to keep in mind. Okay. So that's just, wrapping up the very, very, very basics of climate change science. And I shared all of that because, there are so many different things that we can do to access climate finance and actually, mitigate emissions and adapt to climate change, but we're not doing that, and that is because we've also not understood the entire concept of climate change science well. So hopefully that helped a little. Okay, so now we're moving on to the section of global policies. Okay, so how are we dealing with the whole phenomena of climate change? So there's something called representative concentration pathways that you know that scientists have made to really describe where we can go to in our future. Okay, so, or in other words, what is our future going to look like? And it is important to understand that RCPs, or the representative concentration pathways, are not predictions. We're not saying this is going to happen for sure. So it's not a prediction, but it is rather a projection. So based on whatever we see right now and all of the data, okay, and if we make certain changes, this is how the world's going to look like in 10 years, 20 years. So, it serves more as a projection. And there are four scenarios in that regard: RCP 2.6, RCP 4.5, RCP 6.0, and RCP 8.5. The RCP that we would like to target is RCP 2.6, but that means we need to invest a whole lot in renewable energies, in public transportation. It means temperature will still rise, but it will be possibly capped at 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the impacts that we're going to see is going to be much less compared to the other scenarios. As opposed to the RCP 2.6 is the RCP 8.5 scenario, which is the most disastrous thing that can happen. And that would have happened had we continued our ways, had we gone in a business as usual scenario, like no renewable energies, all fossil fuel powered, then we could have expected at least 3.7 to 4 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures, which would have meant that the impacts of climate change, as we discussed earlier, would have been massive and multiple at the same time. So far, I think recent science has said that we've somehow avoided RCP 8.5 scenario, which is a very good news for us. So I think we still want to strive for RCP 2.6 scenario, which is probably not doable as yet. So maybe we're headed towards a RCP 4.5, RCP 6.0 scenario as of now. Okay. And this is where, the whole global climate policies come in. If you look at the chart on the right, and if you see the no climate policies scenario, then that, had we not reacted on it, then our temperature, like the Earth's temperature, would have increased by 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius. But since we have, as a whole, acted upon the whole issue of climate change, our current policies and what we've targeted is taking us to a 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius increase, which is still better than the business as usual scenario of 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius. However, if we are able to do everything that we've pledged as countries, if we are able to do everything that we've pledged, then the increase will be limited. The increase in temperature will be limited to 2.1 degrees Celsius. But as we saw, that is still a lot of damage and a lot of adapting to do. So we should still strive to do better than that. Okay. So what is the world really doing to respond to climate change? And there are three broad pillars in that regard. Okay. Number one is mitigation. What is mitigation? Mitigation is basically targeting the root cause of climate change, which is greenhouse gas emissions. So any activity, any project that reduces the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted in the atmosphere would comprise of mitigation efforts, right? Examples would be switching to renewable energy or increasing energy efficiency. It could also mean conserving forests because, like I mentioned earlier, their ability to absorb carbon dioxide would help us deal with climate change better, right? So those are all efforts that would come under mitigation. Then we have adaptation, which is like discussed earlier, we know climate change is going to happen anyhow, right? So we have to adjust to those changes, in the present and in the future. So adaptation is more about uh, it deals with those aspects or those actions that um, helps us adapt to those changes. For example, early warning system, it helps saves lives. For example, relocation of communities, that also helps saves lives, right? From flood prone areas, for example, or developing drought resistant crops, or adopting climate smart agriculture. So all of these efforts would comprise of adaptation efforts, right? So the thing about mitigation and adaptation is we need financial resources to do all of this. And that is where climate finance comes in. Okay. So climate finance is okay. Okay. I'm going to define climate finance in a while, but how did climate finance come into being? And I think it is also important to understand that, right? So in 1988, a World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is also known as IPCC. So IPCC is a group of top global scientists coming together to provide peer-reviewed science and evidence to global leaders. Okay. So in 1988, IPCC was formed so that they could give evidence to global leaders. And in 1990, the IPCC came up with their first assessment report. And in 1990, they had enough evidence to say that climate change was being caused by human activities and that it was imperative for us to come together to really face the issues, to help adapt to the changes that we were expecting. So in 1992 is where is so once we got to know, okay, humans are causing climate change. In 1992, it was acknowledged that in fact, all of these changes were happening because of developed countries and their industrial activities. So that was the first time that countries agreed that it was important for developed countries to help developing countries who were not at fault for, the whole phenomena of climate change to occur then. So that was the first time in 1992 that they agreed that they would provide financial support or technical assistance support to developing countries to help adapt to climate change and to help reduce future emissions, right? And it was the same year that UNFCCC that we hear so often about was adopted. COP was the whole concept of COP began, and then COP conference of parties was held every year after that. The Global Environment Facility, which is a form of climate finance, was also established as a funding mechanism. So it started in 1992. Then in 1997, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which formalized the Clean Development Mechanism. So the whole concept of Clean Development Mechanism means because developed countries were already locked in, like we discussed earlier, infrastructure, our economy is already carbon intensive. To change that is very difficult. So they identified that if they were helping developing countries reduce their emissions, then it would be an easier way to reduce emissions. So that's the whole idea of the Clean Development Mechanism. So then developed countries started paying developing countries to reduce their emissions and to adapt to climate change. And in exchange for that finance, developing countries would provide certifications of carbon credits, which the developed countries could use as claiming as that, that they did help with the whole issue of climate change, right? And it was also the year when Adaptation Fund was established. An adaptation fund is also one of the multilateral climate finance sources that we have. We're going to look into it in a while. Okay. Then in 2009, it was agreed that the amount of climate finance that we need to really mitigate and adapt to climate change, you know, it's a lot. And so therefore, developed countries need to provide at least $100 billion per year annually by 2020. So a target was set in 2009. And in 2015, in the famous Paris Agreement, the world came together, all 194 nations, they came together for the first time. And then they agreed that it was imperative to target our future world to head towards a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and to avoid the RCP 8.5 scenario that we discussed earlier, right? So then Paris Agreement also mandated all countries to provide 5-year updates in the form of NDCs and NAPs. We're going to look at it later. And so countries were bound to update how they plan to deal with climate change, right? So that's what happened in 2015. Then in 2021, it was realized that so much of the changes that we see, it's already irreversible and unavoidable. And therefore, in the name of climate justice, the Loss and Damage Fund was established, which is also one of the multilateral funds that we have, that we can access, when we talk about climate finance. And then the latest in 2024, the world agreed that the $100 billion target wasn't enough and that it had to be increased to $300 billion annually by 2035. So as of now, developed countries are supposed to provide $300 billion per year to developing countries in the form of climate finance. Okay. So what is climate finance, right? Unfortunately, we do not have a globally agreed upon definition. And we're going to see why later on. But UNFCCC basically defines climate finance as, national or international financing that helps us mitigate emissions and adapt to climate change. Simple, right? And climate finance was based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which is what I just explained, because the climate change that we're experiencing is not being caused due to developing countries, but in fact due to developed countries and their industrial activities. So the nations, so it's basically the polluter pays principle, right? So whoever polluted, they have to pay. So that's the whole principle that climate finance is based on. And I think it's very evident. However, the other founding principle that most of us do not know about is that there is a new and additional requirement, right? So what does that mean? It means back then when they agreed on climate finance, development aid was already available. So the new and additional was a requirement on developed countries to make sure that they did not count development aid as climate finance, and that the funding that they would have to provide would be new and in addition to the development aid, right? So that sort of defines climate finance so far, but it's still very difficult to really follow, to really track climate finance still, because we do not have an agreed upon definition, right? So if you look at this image, do we have time? Okay, so if you look at this image, then this is basically a boiled down version of the global climate finance architecture. Okay, it's not too complicated. I'll just explain. Okay, so there are various different sources meaning developed countries, of climate finance. Okay, so the different sources of climate finance, different implementing agencies, there are different financial mechanisms, and there are different financial instruments in the whole climate finance architecture. Okay, so if you look at the top, there are names of countries, right? So these are some of the developed countries. So if Pakistan, for example, is able to access climate finance directly from Australia through one of the implementing agencies called DFAT, I think we're very familiar with DFAT. So if Pakistan is able to access the climate finance provided by Australia through DFAT, that would be a bilateral source of climate finance, right? So it could be a direct country to country bilateral source of climate finance, right? In like manner, UK, for example, I worked for FCDO. So UK has 4 different implementing agencies, FCDO being one of them, right? So Nepal gets a lot of funding or climate finance from the UK directly. It's a government to government agreement, right? Then so that's simple. Bilateral sources. It's very simple to follow. Okay, where is it coming from? Where is it going? In which form? It's the easiest, right? Now it gets more complicated because we also have multilateral institutions. So how we discussed the global climate commitments and policies earlier, like Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol, this, that. So, being a part of UNFCCC, so countries are bound, so there are certain financial mechanisms that they have to provide climate finance to these funds, multilateral funds, right? So one financial mechanism would be the UNFCCC mechanism, and the other would be the non-UNFCCC mechanism, as you can see it right there. I'm so sorry, my arrow doesn't work, but you can see it right there, right in the middle. So UNFCCC mechanism, for example, would also include the carbon market. Earlier, which we talked about the clean development mechanism, in Kyoto Protocol, that developed countries would fund developing countries, and then in turn they would get some carbon credits. So that is like a whole carbon market that's there, and that is a form of the UNFCCC financial mechanism. Then the other something, okay, I'm just going to look at GCF. I think we all know about GCF, right? Green Climate Fund. And I think Pakistan's has been able to access a good amount of funding from GCF. So even GCF is a fund within the UNFCCC financial mechanism, which countries can access, right? But this is slightly more difficult. The whole process is more complicated because there are a lot of requirements that we need to meet. So Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, Global Environment Facility, and all of that. So those come under the UNFCCC financial mechanism. Now, the non-UNFCCC financial mechanism, for example, I'm just going to make it very simple, would be the multilateral development banks like World Bank, ADB, etc. Right? So these are the implementing agencies under the non-UNFCCC financial mechanism. However, ADB, World Bank would tend to use the financial instrument of loans, concessional loans, rather than grants, or in the form of equity. So the form of financial instrument that they use would be slightly different than the UNFCCC mechanism. So for example, Adaptation Fund provides it in the form of grants, right? So basically you need to understand that there's just a lot of different sources, a lot of different mechanisms, a lot of different instruments, a lot of different implementing agencies. And when you are trying to identify which climate finance to access, you really need to just know what your project is looking for. Some projects may be more aligned to ADB source of funding. Some projects may be more aligned to adaptation fund. Some projects may be, it may be easier to do with bilateral countries, but then you would have to know which country is prioritizing what kind of project. And so it would be easier to, really access the funds. So basically, this is it. And then there is also like private sources of climate finance. And that is just very difficult to track, and a lot of development is still to happen in that aspect, right? So we're not covering that here. So this is um an image of the current state of climate finance. Okay, if you look at it, don't no need to panic. Okay, because it's very simple. On the left is what we discussed earlier, like governments like Australia, UK, right? So they are the sources of climate finance. There could be different types of sources. You can see corporations, household, individuals, philanthropic foundations, right? So multilateral climate funds. So there are just a lot of different sources. So from these sources, they use different types of instruments. In the middle in gray, if you see, then there's grants, then there's debt, then there's project equity, right? So there's just a lot of different instruments that you can utilize to then see where it ends up. So some of it ends up to LDCs, some of it ends up to emerging markets, to advanced economies. And then this finance has been used 1.907, I think this is in million, has been used for mitigation efforts. 64 million has been used for adaptation, and then $36 million has been used for both adaptation and mitigation efforts. And if you look at it, then it has ended up in different sectors. On the extreme right, the waste management, buildings and infrastructure, transport, energy systems, etc., right? And as of now, I think in 2024, available climate finance was 2.2 or $2.4 billion, trillion dollars. I'm sorry, I lost my note here. Um, right? But and it sounds like it's a lot, and it is a lot. However, it is also important to see that that's still not enough to deal with climate change. That amount is still not enough, and um yeah, that amount is still not enough. And I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, so it is available. Oh yeah. And but it is important to understand that the rate of increase in climate change, although it's reached a certain trillion amount of dollars, the rate has actually decreased over time. And yeah, so basically whatever is available right now is just not enough for us. Okay. So I'm just gonna wrap it up, because we sort of wrap it up. I still have a lot more points to share. But you know, accessing international climate finance is not easy. Luckily, we're now starting to move from the planning, policy, pledges phase to the whole implementation phase. And there's a lot of things that we could and should be doing, right? And some things that we could and should be doing is, from the donor side, for example, I feel like it is really important that we come up with an agreed upon definition of what climate finance counts as, because we really need to avoid the double counting that we're doing with development aid. So developed countries should be providing a lot more finance than they are at the moment, right? And then there's still a huge gap, as I mentioned, between the need of our, how much we need to adapt and mitigate climate change, and how much is available. So developed countries really need to find a way to sort of bridge that gap, right? And then the whole process is so tedious, it's so technical, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of resources, and that should also change from the donor side. They should make it easier for recipient countries like us to be able to access climate finance with more ease and at a faster rate, right? And now on the recipient side, I would say that we need to realize that while we're developing project proposals for climate finance, for example, the climate rationale is very important. It is really important to provide enough data and evidence that shows to the donors that that initiative that you're proposing is actually going to help mitigate emissions and or adapt to climate change, right? So the climate rationale to develop that is so important. And that is why to understand the science of climate change is also important. The second thing from the recipient side is we need to engage more private sector actors because that is where climate action occurs more quickly, and that is where a lot of changes can happen. For example, if you have a brick factory and you want to reduce your emissions, it's, you don't have to go through the entire process of changing policies, this that. It's about, okay, putting a technology that reduces your emissions, and then climate action is done there, right? So we need private sector, and there's a lot more damage that the private sector is also doing to through their greenhouse gas emissions. So on the donor side, they also need to contribute to to providing climate finance for the recipient countries, right? And then, yeah, like I mentioned, recipient countries need to be well aware about the different types of donors, what their requirements are, what are their different processes, because each process varies from the other, right? So in that terms, we really need to build our capacity further. Then, like I mentioned, there are so many different climate finance instruments. For example, carbon markets is a very upcoming thing, and I think it is a priority for Pakistan as well. So, to really be able to utilize diversified climate finance instruments, I think we should go for it. And like mentioned earlier, stakeholder engagement is very important. It's very important to make sure that whatever we're doing is gender responsive as well. With our project development, whatever we do, we have to make sure. And this is also critical to access climate finance because these are the major pillars that the funders and the donors look at. They want stakeholder engagement from the very beginning. They want gender responsive approaches. Okay. And last but not the least, our our proposals and our project development, it needs to be aligned with our national priorities. When I talk about national priorities, unfortunately, I didn't get enough time to look into it in detail, but I would like to urge you to look at three national documents that you have. One is the National Climate Change Policy of Pakistan, which came out in 2021. Basically, the National Climate Change Policy provides an overall strategy on how to deal with climate change, and it basically specifies what are the priority sectors. So if you are planning to access climate finance, you need to make sure that your project is aligned to a priority project of your nation. Okay. The second document is the NDC, or the Nationally Determined Contribution, the third version, which came out in 2025, which Pakistan submitted to UNFCCC in 2025. Okay. And basically, this document outlines how Pakistan plans to reduce its emissions, which is less, but yeah, to reduce its emissions and to adapt to the changing climate, right? And on a quick glance, I noticed that according to Pakistan's NDC, the current requirement or the need for climate finance is $565.7 billion by 2035 for both mitigation and adaptation projects, right? Efforts. So yeah, this is another and NDC has also outlined the priority sectors to be disaster risk reduction, water and sanitation, and low carbon power transition, right? So this is a very useful document that you should stay updated with. And the third being the National Adaptation Plan, which this is probably the second or the third version that Pakistan came out with in 2023. And I wasn't able to go through it in detail, but something that it has mentioned is that Pakistan is planning to come up with a sector-specific investment framework. What does that mean? So this framework is going to be critical to help you access international climate finance, because this framework is going to specify all of Pakistan's priorities, adaptation needs, and it's also going to specify, it's going to be the blueprint which you can refer to create bankable projects. So it's also going to be specifying the different types of projects that you could opt for. So so making it easier for you to really, cut through the hassle of being more technical, or ensuring it aligns with the national priorities. If you just look at this framework, then it will be easier. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but whenever it will be, if not so, then yeah, that would be useful. Um, so yes, I've come to the end of my presentation. I know it was just a very broad overall explanation, and I just hope that you've at least. I mean, there's so much more to be discussed and so much more to be learned about, but I hope that with this presentation, you've at least found one area or one job that you would like to do, where you could ensure that climate action occurs. So yeah, with that, I'd like to end my presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for presenting such a great presentation. And the way you properly described from citizen science till climate finance, the basics of climate science, and then how the UNFCCC do not have a proper defined definition of climate finance, and then how you shifted your the attention of our fellows to the global structure of climate finance, and then the status of climate finance, and then also how you shifted our attention towards the current climate policies in Pakistan. It was truly remarkable. Thank you so much for presenting in such a detailed manner. And really, I'm truly inspired by you, the way you presented during the whole session. And
Thank you so much.
the pleasure is all mine. And for you fellows, the whole workshop is designed in a manner that the part A will be consisting of Melissa's talk or presentation, and after that, I will be asking some questions from Melissa. It will be, you can say, sort of dialogue, where some of the questions will be answered via uh, via Melissa, and then we will be giving the floor to all of you to ask your questions from Melissa. So, Melissa, I will be asking my questions in the domains of, you can say, measuring impact, and then how the stakeholders can engage with each other. And also, I will be asking some of my questions in the domains of the future directions, alongside the how we can learn from our failures. So, my very first question will be from you. How do we measure the effectiveness of climate finance initiatives? What metrics or indicators should be considered to assess the progress?
The thing is, so far, globally, much of the success of climate finance has been measured in the amount of money that was spent. But in my opinion, I think what is more important to see is how effective was the climate action, right? By that, I mean, we really got to look at the climate outcomes. Questions like, questions like, were emissions reduced? Were communities made more climate resilient? Were economic damages avoided? Or did it increase water security or food security, right? Did it protect biodiversity? So I feel like these are the things that should actually be focused on to really assess whether climate finance was a success or not. And unfortunately, um, yeah, much of it is measured in numbers, right? So yeah, that is what I would say.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for your answer. So now I will be shifting my question towards the domain of engaging with the stakeholders. So my second question will be, how important is stakeholder engagement in the climate finance process, and what strategies can be used to involve the local communities and other stakeholders effectively?
I think it's absolutely essential, and the fact that funding donors and funds have made it, in fact, a prerequisite to have stakeholders engaged from the very beginning, says a lot about how important it is, right? So at the end of the day, climate finance has to and should benefit people, and while developing projects, or I think we've already come across the lessons while doing development aid, is that as project developers, we might assume that a certain community um, requires a certain thing based on how we see them from the outside, but to later realize that you put in so much effort, to later realize that what we think they need is not what they need at all, or that they have even better in indigenous ways or indigenous knowledges to really deal with the issues that we're trying to tackle, right? So I would say stakeholder engagement is absolutely necessary from the very beginning to the very end, while doing monitoring and evaluation as well. So yeah, it's very important.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for such detailed answer. And I really second to your thing that the inclusion of the indigenous knowledge is very much important for us, so that our climate finance policies can be more implemented and they can be more strengthened. So, with with an accordance to this question and answer, I would like to shift my question and your attention to the domain of future directions. So, my question is like, looking ahead, what are the most critical action steps we should prioritize in the next few years to translate climate finance strategies into tangible results?
So with this question, I can only but I think it would be relevant to other countries as well, but especially in regard to Nepal, because I've worked here. I would say what needs to change is that Nepal needs to make more bankable climate projects, because so much of the infrastructure development hasn't happened, so much of the urbanization hasn't happened. Nepal could really diversify from its typical adaptation forest conservation capacity building projects to really reducing future carbon emissions by planning cities in a very low carbon or and climate resilient way, right? For example, the way you build a city, how you reach from point A to point B can really determine for the rest of the years how or the quality of that road from point A to point B can really determine the amount of carbon emissions from the cars or the trucks or the vehicles that plow on those roads, right? So urban planning is essential, and I think I would recommend, for example, Nepal to really focus on that. And like I mentioned, avoiding the whole carbon lock-in with infrastructure development. And the second would definitely be involving the private sector because it makes things faster, if more effective, and it is overall more easier to really mobilize climate action. So yeah, if in Nepal's scenario, I would say developing more bankable climate projects and involving the private sector.
And it's very important, I guess, even for the other developing countries and these developed countries, they will be considering this option in order to properly mobilize the funds from the multilateral development banks. So now I would be shifting towards my last question, and that is in the domain from learning from our failures. So my last question is like, what can we learn from unsuccessful climate finance initiatives, and how can these lessons inform future actions?
So four points to that, right? I think, like I mentioned earlier, accessing climate finance was made too complicated, too technical, too time consuming, requiring a lot of different resources and expertise, which differs from source to source, from instrument to instrument, from mechanism to mechanism. So the whole complicated architecture of climate finance really needs to be simplified, and the processes of accessing it needs to be simplified as well, because we really need to get going and mitigate our emissions and adapt to climate change as fast as possible. The second thing is that I would say we need to avoid is trying to the one size fits all theory, right? For example, um, um, you know, Nepal, adopting electric vehicles in Nepal makes a lot of sense because we have renewable energy sources. So when we adopt electric vehicles, we aren't consuming fossil fuels. We're not really emitting carbon into the atmosphere while we operate these vehicles, right? But as opposed to that, let's say I just know about India. So India is a very fossil fuel intensive economy. So even if they adopt electric vehicles, they would, it doesn't make much of a difference because there's that energy for that electric vehicle is still coming from burning of fossil fuels. So that really, because it works for Nepal, it wouldn't really work for India. So, the whole one size fits all is something that we need to avoid. And like I mentioned earlier, the whole urban planning, climate infrastructure projects are something that least developed countries and emerging economies should take into consideration, because we're not locked into high intensive carbon economy yet. And the fourth in Nepal's scenario, I'm not sure if you've heard of Red Plus, or the Leaf Coalition and everything. So, on paper, we've done great. In fact, there's a lot of social media posts going on. Oh, Nepal's been able to, the one country that's been able to increase its forest cover, this, that, this, that, this, that. All great, yes, but do we really know how effective that is? Because, we're not taking into consideration aspects like the age of the tree or the type of tree that we're conserving. Sometimes it actually rather helps to cut it down and then than to have it just there and not be utilized. Or for example, within Red Plus, a lot of indigenous communities lost access in the name of forest conservation. They lost access to forests. So it made their livelihoods very difficult. So we really need to really think about the impacts of our projects like more thoroughly, and yeah, really understand what we're trying to do. So yeah, I think these are some of the things that we could improve moving forward.
Thank you so much. And now, Mike, the sides for my questions are ended, and now I am opening the floor to our fellows. So if you will be having any question to ask from Miss Melissa, you may just raise your hand or you may type your question in the chat box. And if you're raising your hand, just when you will be opening the mic, please feel free to introduce yourself, your name, your profession, and if you're a student, which majors are you pursuing? So over to your questions. Fellows, feel free to utilize this time. We have 10 to 12 minutes, and you can ask any question regarding the climate finance domain from Ms. Melissa.
I guess there is a question from Fatima Fahim, um, where it's been asked, will companies and industries be held accountable and forced to contribute for the damage they've caused? Is there any plan for it? According to The Guardian, 36 countries have been responsible for almost half the world's current emissions, yet have not been held properly accountable, from what I know. Yeah, and I think that's where the whole climate finance, the whole concept of climate finance came into being, that because they've done the damage, they need to pay for it. So that's the whole concept of how climate finance came into being, right? Talking about companies and industries, I think it would really vary depending on the government, like very country to country, because some governments, they just don't care. Some governments would. So yeah, it would really depend, on the government and country to country. Um, but for example, private sectors like the Amazon or Google or Facebook, they have been buying carbon credits from even Nepal, for example, for conserving Nepal's forests, as a way of meeting their net zero targets and as a way of um, paying for the conservation of forests in Nepal. So yeah, there's just a lot more to be done with, but yeah, it would really differ. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for answering the question of Ms. Fatma. So we have two hands raised. The very first is raised by Ms. Zainab. Ms. Zainab, over to you. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Anab and I'm currently doing O levels. I'm in O3. So
Mhm.
my question is, it's about the actual funding portion of climate finance, I mean, how do international organizations decide where the finance is going to be used in order to redevelop their infrastructure? For example, recently, Venezuela got hit with earthquakes, which caused massive waves, which destroyed the infrastructure along the coastline. So, what actions do international organizations take to combat these infrastructure um, destructions, and how do they decide which country to prioritize? As along with Venezuela, many other countries got hit by earthquakes at the same time, with a major portion of their infrastructure being destroyed. So how do they decide what action to take and which country to prioritize or which area to prioritize?
Mm-hmm. Uh, okay, so in regard to Venezuela specifically, because it was an earthquake, for example, just trying to explain, okay? Because it was an earthquake, climate finance does not really come into being, but development aid would come into being, right? For example, let's say Pakistan wants to help Venezuela. So Pakistan would send development aid just for reconstruction or for setting up tents, or so that's more of a diplomatic form of help. But climate finance would be different, because climate finance has to be specifically for climate action. Either you're reducing your emissions or you are adapting to climate change, right? And within that, we saw how that could include a lot of different things, right? So yeah, so one is that, for to assign climate finance or to give climate finance to a certain country, it would really have to be um for climate action, number one. And number two, how do INGOs or donors really decide what they want? I think, like I said, different countries, different governments, they prioritize different aspects. Because I've worked for UK Aid, I can tell you that, two things that they've prioritized for, that has sort of aligned with Nepal's priorities, is, adopting EVs and forest conservation. So they very happily, because what Nepal needs and what they are willing to provide, what UK is willing to provide finance for, sort of aligns, so they come together and they are able to access climate finance for it, right? So this decision would really vary from country to country. For example, US, right? Trump decided he decided to back out of the Paris Agreement. He decided to close all of his implementing agencies, including US Aid, right? So that is also an example how, it really differs from country to country, and even within countries, it differs on the government, and the current political party and their priorities, and that just really needs to align with, for example, in my case, if I'm accessing climate finance for Nepal, my nation's priority needs to align with what they are willing to fund for. Yeah, and that's how, you can access climate finance, but it would really vary. That's why it's a lot of work to identify, which source to look at, and the whole process is different for each. For USAID, it's different. For SCDO, it's different. For DFAT, it's different. So yeah. Unfortunately, I can't just specify it. It really depends on the government, the political, their donors, political parties, priorities, what they think is important, what's not important. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
So I guess, Ms. Zainab, you may have gotten your answer from Miss Melissa, and we can shift to Ms. Gulaz. Ms. Gulaz, you have raised your hand. Please ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes, I can hear
Okay.
you.
I am Gulnaz Kapoor from International Relations Department, Semester 6. So, as you said earlier, our whole economy depends on the activities that produce the carbon emission or cause it. So, my question is, if our economy still depends on the carbon emission, how can we fight the climate change without slowing our economic growth?
Yeah, that's the whole thing, right? We don't want to, when we're talking about dealing with climate change, we really give a lot of importance to economic development as well. We are not saying climate needs to be saved, or we need to do this, do that, and forget about development. That's not what we want. So luckily, we have alternate options, right? For example, for Nepal, um, I wouldn't really say it is an entirely carbon intensive economy, because much of the energy that we consume on a national level comes from hydropower, which is a renewable energy. So, emissions are already less, right? Um, so I think, depending on the country, for example, if there is a form of renewable energy that you can opt for, which could include solar. Solar could go everywhere. Solar is sun everywhere. You can really utilize that energy to harness that energy to do all that you need to do. Basically, economy, when we're talking about economy, if one easy way of doing it is to really, what is the national grid connected to? National grid meaning, where are you getting your energy from? For example, you're using your energy like while staying at home right now, but where is your home getting that energy from? Is Pakistan burning fossil fuels like coal to provide electricity to you? Or is it using hydropower? Or is it using solar, wind? So at a large scale, really changing your source of energy to renewable energy would really, it wouldn't matter if it was a renewable energy. It wouldn't really matter how much energy you're using, right, at home right now to light up your room, for example. So yeah, I think in regards to, like, if we're talking about the economy as a whole, one major, although it needs a lot of money, thing that we can do is to just opt for renewable energy sources. Yeah, that would be the easier way to go. Easier, but not so easy.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gulnaz, for asking a question. And I guess due to the limited constraint of time, we will be taking two more questions. And but I assure all of my fellows that the questions that you have in your mind, please forward it to my team or to myself, and then I and my team will be responsible to get all those answers for your questions from Miss Melissa and then transfer and forward it to you. So I guess we will be taking two more questions, one from our fellows, those who have raised their hands, and one from the chat box. So Melissa, we have one question from the chat box, and this question is from Miss Mariam Itsam. She's saying, "Hi, I'm Mariam. My interest lies in the local level government in terms of climate change. Most climate finance flows to national governments, but climate impacts are felt at city and local government level. What policy frameworks can enable direct access to climate finance for subnational actors, bypassing the bottlenecks of central government systems?"
This is a very good question, right? And it is so true, because much of the climate action actually happens at the local, provincial level. Um, Unfortunately, depending on which source of climate finance you want to access, it would differ, right? So, for example, if you want to access the Green Climate Fund, which has, evidently we've heard about it, it has a lot of climate finance available, and it says that it's going to prioritize countries like us. But, as a to access Green Climate Fund, you have to include the national designated authority, in which case I think for Pakistan is the Ministry of Environment and is the Ministry of of Climate Change and Environment Coordination. So I think that's the NDA, or the focal point who acts, who is the pathway to the Green Climate Fund. So yeah, that's one thing. The other thing that, realizing whatever you just mentioned, um, okay, so sorry, coming back to the Green Climate Fund thing. So basically, to conclude that point, what I'm trying to say is it's a little bit difficult to really bypass those processes. But at the moment, because for example, Nepal has realized that that is critical, and you lose a lot of time, a lot of bureaucracy is involved, and a lot of efforts go into all of those middle parties. We are coming up with a local level climate finance framework. I don't know what that's going to look like, but hopefully once that is available, then maybe, with in talks with the donors um, or the funds, then maybe we would be able to identify a local level body to be capable enough to handle all of the climate finance that comes to it. Another reason why they want a national level to be involved is because it's a huge amount of money that they can't just, they need to be assured that the recipient is able to really handle the money and really be able to make good use of it. So, there's a whole process to become an NDA for GCF. For example, the Ministry of Environment or Climate Change, sorry, I forgot. So the Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan did have to go through a lot of process to meet the requirements of being an NDA for GCF. So my assumption is that even at the local level, if you choose a body at the local level, it should be able to, it should have the capacity to really do everything that climate finance needs to do and go through all of the processes. And yeah, for now, unfortunately, it's a little difficult, but hopefully in the years to come, that will be facilitated. But great question.
Thank you so much, Miss Mariam, and I believe that you have gotten your answer for your question. So we will be taking one more question, and then we'll be wrapping up today's session. Ms. Sarfa, you have raised your hand. Over to you.
Hello, hi. Am I audible to you?
Hi.
My
Yes,
name
yes,
is
I can hear
Sarah.
you.
I have completed my FSC like few days ago. So my interest in local communities development. I have seen many communities are like they are leaving their place because of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So like climate finance is intended to support vulnerable communities that are most affected by climate change. So, like many reporters that I have seen, like I have worked in their communities, so
Mm-hmm.
their report suggests that significant portion of climate finance does not reach local communities.
Mm-hmm.
So, like in your experience, what are the barriers that are making the local communities migrate from their own places, and why are the climate finance is not there for them? And they are migrating from their own places.
So there are two aspects to your question that I see. Okay, so one is related to climate change science, the other is related to climate finance, right? Um, relocation of communities is literally the last straw. It's the most difficult thing to do. Even when communities and people face flooding every year, for example, if they are in a flood-prone zone, right? Even if they face it every year, because they fear of being landless, right? In South Asian culture, it's so important to own land or to own a house, I guess. I'm not sure how it is in Pakistan, but in Nepal it is. So, just from the fear of not owning your own piece of land or your own piece of, or your own house in Nepal, for example, people still go back to the same flood prone area and rebuild the same house for it to get damaged again the next year, or after a year or two. So the whole idea of relocation is actually very, very difficult. although very ideal, it's very difficult to convince them to relocate. And it also requires a lot of money, not just from international sources, but also from one's own government, right? It's easier to access international climate finance if those funders and those donors know that the Pakistani government or the Nepali government are ready to help their own people, and that they are ready to, in fact, put a certain percentage of what they've assigned as a climate budget from their national budget, right? And if they assign it, then it's easier to access funding for such big projects like relocation, right? um so even though science, we can identify areas that are prone to landslide, prone to floods. So scientifically, it makes a lot of sense to relocate them, but culturally and emotionally and mentally, socially, it's a very difficult thing to do. And yeah, in terms of climate finance, I think the question was how to access it. Was it? Sorry, could you repeat the climate finance aspect of your question, please?
My question was that like climate
Oh,
finance is not directly given to the
yeah.
local communities and are not receiving that directly. What's the barrier preventing climate finance from reaching local communities?
Okay, so like we saw, right now, even for me to access, having had worked in this sector for such a long time, it's such an evolving, it's so dynamic, everything changes day to day. What's there yesterday isn't there today, what's there going to be there tomorrow isn't there today. So the whole architecture is so complex that even, I would say, even national level bodies and experts and governments are still trying to grasp their way around, finding their way around this architecture of climate finance, right? So at the moment, I think, like I said, it is important. I completely agree that it should go directly to the local level. And I think for that, there is a fund that was recently made called Local Level Adaptation Fund. So, that would be an easier fund for you to access for the local level communities. And I think you should definitely, look into their websites. I can share with Daniel a lot of different interactive websites to donors, this, that, so you can get a lot of information to see what is more suitable for your for your project. But yeah, so until then, okay, locally led adaptation fund is there, but until then, until the other funds catch up to providing finance for the local level, I think local level communities should also increase their capacity to be able to really deal with climate change. So once they have the capacity, I think it'll be easier, and donors will most likely be more willing to fund it directly to the local level community. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sarfa, for asking a question, and I believe that you have gotten your answer. So, Melissa, I have just one small query. In Pakistan, we do have a concept of horizontal horizontal buildings, like where we usually build our homes on horizontal spacings. When I came to China, I saw that here the concept is completely different. It's the concept of vertical building. Like the
Mhm.
people, they usually prefer buying apartments and living in apartments rather than the villas or bungalows. So, how is it in Nepal?
I think it's Nepal has been in between the two, right? Unfortunately, we fall in the what do you the earthquake prone zone. So we are a very earthquake prone country. So because population increased, the available amount of land isn't enough, and it's too expensive, Nepal did opt for high rise buildings, and had just started to opt for high rise buildings and apartments and stuff like that. And then in 2015 we were hit with 7.9 and a 7.9 and a 7.5 earthquake 2 weeks apart. And then we saw how Nepal isn't really made for high-rise buildings. And then after, real estate projects have moved from high-rise to horizontal, which makes it more difficult. But yeah, I guess other factors have influenced that decision for our country. What is it like in oh, okay, so in Pakistan it's horizontal, right?
In Pakistan, it's horizontal, but here in China, it's completely different.
I-
And
Is there is there a particular reason why like horizontal is preferred there?
in China, in Pakistan, well, since partition, the whole concept is like uh, from our forefathers. It's like they have to buy the lands and they have to build their whole big villas, and from like generation after generation, the whole concept is like being followed upon. And
Mm,
I believe that the Gen Z, they can change this concept, and they might be uh, shifting their attention from buying the villas from the horizontal building concept to the vertical building concept, because I believe uh, because I was seeing like in Pakistan now there are a lot of the vertical buildings projects. There are a lot of companies in Pakistan who have like properly commenced their projects of apartments, commercial buildings where the people or the families can have their homes in as in forms of apartments. They can have their offices for their children. They have recreational areas, and they have different sort of activities in that whole surrounding area. So this is the whole thing in Pakistan, and let's hope uh, what will happen in just like next 5 to 10 years, because these 5 to 10 years will be deciding the whole concept of vertical buildings.
interesting. And so I guess, yeah, please do, if you have any more questions, I would love to connect with you all on LinkedIn or on Instagram. And then, if you have any questions, or if you want to stay connected, I'm always available, and I will try to answer all of your questions. And I will also be sharing a document tomorrow with Danielle, where I will link all of the interactive websites and all of the sources of climate finance. So it'll be easier for you to really build on the knowledge that was shared today. And I hope it wasn't too complicated. I really tried to simplify it a lot, but there's just a lot more to cover. This was just, the basics today. So, yeah, thank you so much for having me, Danielle.
No
And thank you
worries.
so much, everyone, for joining in.
So before properly ending our session, I would like to request everyone to please turn on their cameras if they're comfortable. Let's just click one of our snapshots, and then we are good to go to properly conclude our session. So guys, if you are feeling free, and just please open your video cameras so that we can click a snapshot, and then we can properly end our today's session. No one is feeling comfortable to open their video cameras. Oh, that seems interesting. Let's see who can turn on their video cameras. Okay, so let's just do it. 3, 2, 1. You guys can do the victory sign, or it's up to you. Which sign do you like the most? So ready? 3, 2, 1. Let me do one more, and then we are good to go. So one last snapshot, and then we are good to go. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Yeah, perfect.
Thank
So
you.
you're welcome. With that being said, and with that being done, now let's just properly conclude our session. So thank you all for joining us today for this insightful session from one of our workshops of the Climate Finance Leadership Series. We are truly grateful to each of you for being a part of this important conversation. A special thanks goes to our esteemed guest speaker, Ms. Melissa Pradhan. Your expertise and insights into how we can effectively translate climate finance strategies into action have provided us with invaluable knowledge and inspiration. And thank you sharing your experiences and practical approaches. And I truly appreciate the time and effort that you devoted to our discussion today. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to all our participants and fellows who have contributed to this enriching dialogue. Your questions, thoughts, and perspectives are what makes these sessions meaningful and impactful. And remember, it is through our collective efforts and collaboration that we can drive real change in the climate finance landscape. So we hope you found this session as inspiring as I did, and my team did. And I really look forward to seeing you at our next event in the Climate Finance Leadership Series. Until then, stay engaged, stay informed, and let's keep the momentum going. So thank you once again, and wishing you all a very happy, blessed night ahead.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's workshop.